your attention to our subject of the day. We'll bring her up in just a second here. Katerina von Bora, otherwise by her married name, Luther. Announcements. Right.
Yeah, we have a town hall next Sunday at 4 o'clock, and yes, it's before the pizza, sorry about that, but it's gonna be nice and short, so. If you can
Okay,
do it-
short town hall next Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock. Okay? Steve?
Next Saturday, need you guys to come here, build pizzas for the pizza supper on Sunday. Usually only takes about an hour, maybe a little over. But it's a good time to learn marketing skill and socialize. And then on Sunday, at 5 p.m. is a pizza supper. We'll have the place set up. All the pizza you can eat. And trivia afterwards. Lisa Tebow is going to be leading us in the trivia competition again. And next Sunday after Bible class, we need some help setting this room up. I guess first for the voters or town hall, and then for the pizza supper. That shouldn't take very long either.
Going once, going twice. Catechism, before we dismiss the kids. I did the Sixth Commandment 2 weeks ago, and Pastor Casey said it. He was in a hurry last week and he didn't have a chance to do it. So we'll continue with the 7th commandment. So repeat after me. You shall not steal. What does this mean? We should fear and love God, so that we do not take our neighbor's money or possessions, or get them in any dishonest way, but help him to improve and protect his possessions and income. This is the word of the Lord. All right. Sunday school is dismissed. And then we'll pray together once for all. Takes away. And the prayer is, if you have the book, I'm using the prayer at the end of each lesson. So you'll see it here, and you can see it also in your book, if you have one at home. And I think we still have a few in the bookstore.
Yes.
All right, we do in that bookstore, okay? All right, let us pray. O God, our refuge and our strength, you raised up your servant Katerina to support her husband in his task to reform and renew your church in the light of your word. Defend and purify the church today, and grant that, through faith, we may boldly support and encourage our pastors and teachers of the faith as they proclaim and administer the riches of your grace made known in Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. All right, Katerina von Bora Luther. I was going to call her Katie, but I changed my mind. I had to do a search for a place. Luther called her Katie, but the church uses her maiden name in honoring her. Luther was her married name, Katerina von Bora. So we're going to talk about her life and times, her marriage to Martin, and her legacy. And if you want to follow along in your book, I'm not using all of what's in the book, but I'm pretty well going to give you the information that's there. Pages 230 and 231 in your text, Celebrating the Saints. And the question was asked, why are we doing the saints? Well, I could give you the patent answer, well, because Pastor already said we were going to study the saints. But that's only part of the answer. I asked him why, and he said, because it's fit and right that we should honor those who have gone before us. We're all saints of God, whether we're still living and breathing or whether we're departed. But those who have gone before us are the ones who have left a legacy for us in their lives and in their witness and in their deaths in many cases. That's not the case with Katerina. We'll see that in a few seconds here. But that's the reason why. So taking a little change of pace, we're going to look at some of the saints of the church. And the first three that he gave me, which are not necessarily in the chronological order of the church, because the first two, the 13th of December and the 20th of December, they were passed, before Christmas. So we're kind of catching up a little bit. But Katerina von Bora, her life and times. And that's a picture of her about the year 1523, 24, before she was married. So some would say she was a plain-looking young lady. I don't know. She looks a pretty young lady, and certainly a very strong saint of the church. So we're going to look at her life and times. Unlike Lucy of Syracuse that we talked about 2 weeks ago, Katerina von Bora, and I apologize, I left the Katerina in there, I had Katie before, isn't recognized as an ecumenical saint. What does that mean? She isn't recognized as an ecumenical saint. The second sentence gives it to you.
Only Lutherans might recognize her.
Only Lutherans, okay? If she were an ecumenical saint like Lucy, who's recognized by the Lutheran Church, other Reformed churches, by the Catholic Church, by the Eastern Orthodox, she would be an ecumenical saint, but she's not, because she's unique to the Lutheran tradition. Only recently, and I tried to find out the when, but it's somewhere in the last 25 or 30 years, the Episcopal Church in America came to recognize her as well. Perhaps it was coming up on the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. I could not find that out. It's something you could take a look at for us. Her traditional feast day is observed by the Lutheran Church on 20 December, the day she died. And that's a lot of times, it's either the day they were born or the day they died. And note, she died in Torgau. We'll come back to that in a little bit here. Okay? Katerina was born in Lippendorf, or a village or town somewhere close by, on 29 January 1499. When do you think Luther was born? He was older than she was. When was Luther born? 1484. So he was 15 to 16 years older than Katerina. Now, the von, V-O-N, in any German name then and even today, is an indicator of some nobility. Well, she was not of the house of the emperor or anything like that, or an elector or whatever, but her family had a lineage of some minor nobility. So that's where, that particular name comes in. It indicates nobility. Pardon?
Would that be like Duke in the British royal family?
Perhaps like the Duke of Windsor or whatever. Yeah. No, it's just a German thing as far as I can tell. I don't know if the equivalent would be in English royalty.
Just figuring minor
Royalty.
royalty.
Okay. Good question though. When she was only 3, her mother passed away. So, at 1504, 2 years later, okay, her father decided to place her in the Benedictine convent, placed her at Brena for the sake of furthering her education. In those days, if you weren't royalty and living in the court and had courtesans and others scholars that were there at the court, you didn't get much education other than perhaps in the trades or whatever. And definitely as a young woman, you would have gotten very little of any education. But in the cloisters, they educated the nuns. They taught them how to read and write, not only in Latin, but in German, and they taught them many, many other talents. So she was trained at that young age of 5 in that Benedictine cloister. In 1509, she moved to the Cistercian monastery at Nimschen, because it was a place for daughters of I like this, daughters of noblemen. So her father found her a posher place to live, basically, okay? It was also where her aunt resided. So a close relative, he wanted her to have some companionship there. And it was there that she learned to read and write in German as well as some Latin. She learned how to cook and do needlecraft, as well as heal with herbs and medicine, and all things, interesting, that she would need later when she was married. So all things that a young woman would need, but keep in mind, she's in a cloister, in a nunnery. She took her vows as a nun in 1515, so she was there for a while, and she took her vows as a sister in 1515. And that's where the story changes, because when you took your vows, your life changed. You gave up your common, everyday, pedestrian, civil life, and you became a member of the church. Not long after she became a nun, she began to hear about the events of the Reformation. 1515, when did Luther nail his 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg? 1517. But there was also things stirring ahead of that date. So she began to hear things, that there was other, teachings going on in the church. And as the momentum, the movement gained momentum, she and other sisters heard and read eagerly about the theological changes coming to the church through the work of one Martin Luther. One of the things that made Luther, and we know this from history, so popular in his day was what technology? The printing press. Okay? The printing press. No sooner had he penned the 95 Theses and put them on the bulletin board at the church or nailed them on the door. You couldn't nail them on the door today, although I didn't get to see it. I've seen pictures. The Castle Church door today is bronze because they were burned about 300 years ago in one of the things, many campaigns of war that swept across Europe. So they put bronze doors up there, so you wouldn't have nailed it to the bronze. But way back when, they put notices and other pamphlets and things like that on the door. Well, no sooner did he do that than a printer there in Wittenberg and nearby, they printed off thousands and thousands of copies. It's like the latest and greatest extra edition. Hear ye, whatever. This is the latest that you ever would see through the works of Martin Luther. Before she actually met Luther, though, she'd heard of him through several instances. Her close friend in the convent was one sister by the name of Magdalena von Staupitz. And she was a sister of Johann von Staupitz, who was Luther's confessor and confidant at the Augustinian monastery at Erfurt. So, brother and sister, they must have corresponded because Magdalena was one of the nuns who also left at that time later on when Katharina left. Okay, so they had something in common there. We know from history that Luther preached on at least 2 occasions in Grimma, about 6 miles north of her convent in Nymchen. So he was in the neighborhood. So they may have gone to see him, hear of him, or whatever. And Katharina, like almost everyone in Germany, had heard of Luther, his preaching and writing after 1517. You couldn't be more than a doorpost and not have heard of Luther. If you had ears, you heard of Luther, and he was popular in that particular part of Europe. Before they ever met, Katharina was able to build a picture of Luther through his teaching, writing, and preaching. So she had a concept. She understood who he was. From Luther, Katharina learned the biblical and Reformation gospel that we are righteous before God by Christ alone, through faith alone, and by grace alone, according to the scriptures alone. So the 3 solas, we have then Christ alone, faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone. And scripture summarizes the whole thing. So they knew this. So how could Katharina and her fellow sisters react to this wonderful good news? This was different, radically different than anything the church had taught for over 1,000 years and was teaching even at that time. After all, Katharina and her colleagues had taken the 3 vows of obedience to their superiors, vows to the superiors, vow of poverty, and a vow of chastity. And once you did that, you were locked. You basically had given up all rights to your property, all rights to your soul, and your physical, very physical being belonged to the church at that time. Leaving the convent and living in ordinary society would mean smashing or breaking these 3 vows, which meant she would be breaking canon law. And the penalty for canon law was either death or at least a lifetime of imprisonment and punishment. So these sisters who left along with Katharina, they were bold. They knew exactly what the risk was, and yet they were determined to get out of the convent. Now, others were leaving around Europe. Not as many sisters I found out as in terms of the monks and the friars, but there was a movement out of the cloisters and the monasteries about this time. And the attractiveness of justification by faith and the priesthood of all believers were powerful draws at that time for the people of that day. We'll sit down here. So that's what they were looking for. They wanted a way out, and they knew there was a brighter future down the road. Katharina had also heard of some monks who had recently rebelled and left their monastery at Grimna. That's 6 miles away. So, they did it. Why couldn't they do it? Well, young ladies did not have all the resources that young men did, or older men did, so they reached out. Despite the punishments that they and the other 10 nuns from Nipshin, including her fellow sister Magdalena, who was Staupitz, they had to take action. And they decided to do what? Like Martin Luther. He had rebelled, he had left, and he was okay. Yeah, the Pope had condemned him, but he was still alive and breathing and working around Europe. So they decided to write him and ask for his help. They didn't have to write a second time. The first time was the charm. And he began to make arrangements for their departure. Luther lined up a friend of his, Leonhard Kappa, or Kopp, depending how you look at it, who was 60 years old, and he was a merchant in Torgau, nearby, who delivered supplies, including pickled herring, to the convent in Nymschen. Now, depending on where you look on the internet, there are a couple of different ways this escape happened. And we know the exact date on the night of 4th of April, the night before Easter Sunday in 1523, they escaped. The question is, were they in the barrels or among the barrels? If you've ever smelled a fish barrel, you know, they're not very good. You know, dead fish and all that have a very, very pungent aroma. So did the sisters, were they sequestered inside the barrel or simply among the barrel? Sue?
I'll split the babies, they were both.
They were both.
There's 12 of them, again.
They took lots and some got the barrel, some got the whatever. It's an interesting story how they got where they were going to go. I think they hid among the empty fish barrels and remained hidden all the way for several hundred miles from southwest Germany all the way up to northeast Germany to Wittenberg. And that was perilous not only because they were escaping, but they were also going through enemy territory politically. The Dutch, ducal Saxony, I'm thinking the Saxon territory was not sympathetic to the Reformation. It was very much Catholic. So they had to be very quiet and had to endure a long, hard journey, being jostled among their barrels, going down the roads. They didn't have super highways like we did today. And certainly a wagon with fish barrels didn't go very far, very fast. So the next day, however, they were able to get to Wittenberg. So what happened to them? 12 of them reached Wittenberg. Well, 3 went back to their families immediately. And Luther's first thought was, could they go back to their homes, where they come from? Well, some, like in Katharina's case, her father would not take her back. He says, you are our sister, you're in the cloister, and I'm not taking you back. And others were the same way. 6 swiftly married off, or settled with homes, or were employed in homes. So that's 9 altogether. 2 of the 3 remaining were eventually married, leaving only Katharina. Katharina remained in Wittenberg, and she lived with 2 families before moving to the home of Lucas, it should be Lucas Cranach. Lucas Cranach the elder and his wife. If you know the paintings, the wood carvings that you'll see of the Reformation, Cranach was a wood carver and did a lot of portraits of Luther and the other members of the Reformation. So she stayed with 2 families, winding up with Lucas Cranach. And she was asked, would she marry either of the men of the 2 families? And she said, well, no. No. She wanted only one man. She had her eyes set on one man, and that was Martin Luther. So Lucas, even I understand, proposed to her, but she said no. She said no. During this time, Katharina had at least 2 suitors. One was Jerome Baumgartner, a student at Wittenberg, and the second was Dr. Caspar Glass, a pastor. And they lived with the Cranachs and all that. So there's a whole swirl of people that were there. And the student, his parents said no. You want to marry this girl? An escaped nun? A rebel? No, no, we're not having you do that. Try again. And Dr. Watts, a pastor, said, well, I would, but she said no. In the end, Katharina told Nicholas von Amsdorf, again that von word there, a fellow reformer with Luther, that she would be open to a proposal from either him or Martin Luther. But always it was somewhere Luther was in the equation. So Nicholas von Amsdorf, she found a little bit of favor with him, but she still said, no, I'm waiting for Martin Luther. Here's a picture of the Luther family with 5 kids. We'll see later that Martin and Katharina had 6 live children, but 1 died shortly after birth. So that's why there are only 5 pictured in the painting here. And Luther was a musician. What type of instrument is that, you think? A lute. A lute. He played the lute. Played other instruments, including the recorder and things like that. So in addition to being a theologian, he was also a trained musician. He wrote music. And we have a number of tunes that still exist in the church today that he wrote, perhaps on his lute. He could play that and sing with the family. They had time together. And that's one of his fellow, I think that may be Philip Melanchthon in the back there, but it's a fellow, it's a student that was lodging with the Luthers at that time. So eventually, although Luther had no desire to marry, he thought he was too old for her at the age of 41, and she was 26. Okay? This was also the time of the Peasants' Revolt in Germany, 1524 to 1526. If you remember the 2003 movie on Luther, you remember the Peasants' Revolt? Luther was at the Wartburg translating the New Testament, and he heard all the rumblings and everything of what was happening in Wittenberg, and he comes back to Wittenberg as Prince George, or Knight George, and he rides into town, and they're looting the churches. They're smashing the altars. They're destroying the stained glass windows. They're smashing the statues of the saints. And one of his very good friends from before, when challenged by Luther, why are you doing this? Well, to reform it, we've got to destroy it. We've got to cleanse the church of all this, the trappings of the papacy and everything. And Luther said, no, absolutely not. Whatever is helpful to the Christian in their worship life, in their life of piety, is helpful. Don't do those things. And he threw the bomb out of town. So, but there was a great revolt at that time. The peasants got their hands on the reins of power, okay, and for 2 years they ransacked towns and castles and all kinds of things. And so finally, the church and the electors of that time put them down. It was a very bloody revolt at that time. So Luther is seeing all this going around. He's saying, I don't need to get married. I got so many other things to worry about here. Besides, history tells us he wasn't particularly attracted to Catherine. Whether it was the color of her hair, color of her eyes, the shape of her face, what, we don't really know. But he didn't express any desire for her. So he said, no, I'm not going to have it. But, I like this part of the story. When he realized that he needed a wife, that his life as a scholar, his life as a pastor, was incomplete. Paul talks about an elder being the husband of one wife, and then he goes on and describes, not being tempted by spirits and things like that, alcohol and things like that, not given to drunkenness and orgies and all that, but a very statement. So Luther knew that something was going on, and since he had come from a life of celibacy, the answer was not only to reform the church in its teaching, but to reform the church in its practice. And that was to break the vows of celibacy. Many would say that the church today, the Roman church today, still has that same problem, don't they? The church today is rife with so many examples still of pedophiles that are priests and are still molesting, particularly young men, young boys. So there are very few, priests, young men going into the priesthood anymore. The priests that are of the Catholic Church today are growing older and are dying off. And what do we see the church doing? What's their answer? Consolidate, centralize, because we don't have enough priests to go around. So one priest will serve 3 or 4 different congregations or churches, 1 day a week here, 2 days a week there, 1 day a week there, and so forth. I don't think Mary Help of Christians today has its own priest, and that's just down the street. So the church had a problem. So Luther said, well, maybe I need to by example. And he had help from others around him that encouraged him. But he realized that he needed a wife, and that by marrying, he'd be setting a good example to the Roman monks and nuns who were fleeing from their vows, because the floodgates had been opened, and they were all leaving.
Didn't she make good beer? I thought she made good beer. She had a good recipe or whatever, Catherine.
Okay?
Hey, if you gotta marry,
Okay,
creates that
Patrick,
wonderful,
was?
comfortable environment.
Alcohol helps. No, all right. So Luther then needed to go find a wife. A friend of Luther summarized his thinking by saying, by taking himself to himself a wife, he wished to please his father, tease the Pope, and vex the devil. That's a good combination. His father had always wanted him to get married, because what did his father and mother want him to be earlier on? A lawyer. A rich lawyer, or whatever. Okay, he could make money. It was a valued profession even then. But he chose to become a poor mendicant beggar in the Augustinian order. No future ahead. And besides, the Luther line would have ended, because he was their only child, and he was not going to get married because he was going to be celibate for the rest of his life. Now what are they to do? So they were very much in favor of that. To tease the Pope by this breaking the vow of celibacy and getting married, and to vex the devil. Okay? Because Luther knew when he went to Rome, and it's also in the 2003 movie, when Luther took that long journey to Rome, he saw the debauchery and the evil that was present in Rome. They had more than one house of ill repute, let's say, for priests and for bishops and cardinals and all that. They had nuns who were nothing more than prostitutes. That's what they did. That's how they were dedicated to the Lord. Can you imagine? That's what he saw. And he said, I'm going to put an end to this if I can marry and I can live a decent, chaste life being married. So he also said, by marrying, he would make the angels laugh and the demons weep. Kind of the same thing. So Luther wasted no time. Once he had decided, he was very much thinking, I love this. He and Katharina were engaged and married on the same day. So when he decided, there was no waiting. They got a small group together, and he and Catherine were married. And when some people questioned him later on, he said, we're married. That's it. No more. We're married. About a week later, they solemnized it by going to the church there in Wittenberg, and their marriage was blessed. But they were married at the Augustinian monastery, the former one in Wittenberg, on Tuesday, 13 June 1525. He was 41 and she was 26. All right. Both of Luther's parents were present for the wedding, so he must have made them very happy. Finally, after so many years, their son, their one and only son, had decided to do what they wanted. He was there, and they blessed the wedding. His message to them essentially was, now I have married, we will have children, and you will have grandchildren. Okay, that's what the marriage is all about, having children. It's sad in our society today that there are so many young people who get married who have no concept of being a parent or having a child or what they would do. So when they get pregnant, it's like, okay, now what do we do next? Well, unfortunately, the first answer is, well, we can abort this thing. It's not necessary. We don't have to carry this through. When the whole process of coming together, two people as one flesh, is all about having children. Well, Luther and Katie, they honored that. We will have children, and you, meaning his parents, will have grandchildren. Their marriage, this is interesting, re-energized Luther in his writing to defend the gospel. And it wasn't long after that, about 2 or 3 months later, that he published The Bondage of the Will. If you haven't ever read that book, it's about maybe 100 pages long. We have it, I think, in our bookstore here. Definitely can get in the library upstairs. You probably can find it online as well. The Bondage of the Will. Erasmus, the great Greek scholar, the great liberal theologian of the time, he was again for the freedom of the will. Luther says, no, Our consciences are in chains. They are bound to our sinfulness. And we cannot of ourselves, make ourselves holy. We cannot of ourselves believe in the Lord. It takes God working on us. And that's one of his greatest works. That was kind of the changing point when that was published in 1526. And Katharina strongly encouraged Martin Luther to defend the truth against humanism, a blessed ministry which endeared every Reformed Christian to Mrs. Luther. I'll tell you a little bit more of that in a little bit here. Katharina swiftly began the task of settling into the former Augustinian monastery as well as Luther's personal affairs. Now, one of our goals, had we finished our trip in 2010 and going to Wittenberg, would have been to see the Luther House, which is in that same location. So after the brothers had all left, the monastery was sitting there empty. And so the elector at the time says, Luther, why don't you and Katie take it? It's yours. This thing is as big as a dormitory at a college. Essentially what it was. It had, probably 30 or 40 cells for the monks, and a big kitchen, and a big dining hall, and all kinds of things. And it had land all around it that the brothers used to farm and raise animals on. It was a big house for Katharina von Bora, Luther, to be in charge of. Now, one aspect of his personal affairs, I didn't put on the slide. She found when they first went to bed the night of their wedding to celebrate their honeymoon, I don't think they called it that, she found the bed was absolutely despicable. He hadn't changed the sheets in over a year.
That's a bachelor.
She found mold and mildew and all kinds of stuff. And his pillow was nothing but stained from his tears. So she had to strip the beds, find some new sheets. I don't know what she did, burn the other sheets or whatever. She had to clean house before they could even go to bed. And they were so poor in the beginning that they only had one pillow. And so they would sleep together on one pillow. I don't think I've ever tried that. Have we ever had one pillow to share? No, we always had at least two. So sleeping together on one pillow would be tough. But they did it because that's all they had to start with. But she had to very quickly start training Luther. Martin, you don't do these things. You need to change your linens. I'm here to help you. I'm here to help you. In the process, as they developed as husband and wife, they were blessed with 6 children in the order of boy, girl, girl, boy, boy, girl. I don't think there's anything particular in that sequencing, but anyway. Hans, their oldest boy, studied law and became a court advisor, a politician you could call him. Martin, the second boy, studied theology. Although he was not ordained as a pastor, he was a teacher and followed in his father's footsteps. Paul, the third boy, studied medicine and became a famous physician or healer at that time. Now what about the girls? Elizabeth, the first girl, died after only 8 months. That's why she's not in the painting that I showed you there. She died at the age of 8 months. Magdalene died in her father's arms at the age of 13, and that about broke Luther's heart. I've read letters that he wrote to friends. It about crushed him because she was very dear. The first daughter that lived after the first one had died, and she dies at the age of 13. Marguerite, or Margarata, whatever, lived out a normal life and died at the age of 66 or something like that. The Luthers were survived by 4 of their 6 children. Lifetimes were not that long at the time, but they were survived by 4 of their 6 children. Katharina and Martin lived for 21 years of married life in that former monastery in Wittenberg, and it was formally given to them, finally, by Elector Frederick the Wise in 1532. So a little bit later, like 6 years after they were married, they finally got the deed to the property. All right, Martin, here's your home. It's yours. Take care of it. Their home saw many guests over the years, so much so that it was called then the Saxon Hotel, or later God's Inn. I don't think they had a shingle outside or a neon flashing light, but anyone coming to Wittenberg, if they needed a place to stay, go knock on Katie's door, and she'd let them in. And she'd find a place somewhere. They had students who lived there, some which paid a little bit of room and board to them, and some which did not. They never made money off of this, dormitory, this house that they shared together. Luther certainly didn't make a lot of money. He was a poor university professor. All the things he wrote and were all published and all that, guess what? They didn't have copyrights at the time. They didn't have trademarks or anything like that. Then he wrote and gave things away, and he never saw a dime. The printers were the ones who made the most money out of it. But that didn't stop Katharina. She was a family treasurer, and some would say that she actually brought in more money than her husband did. Okay? She was a treasurer, she was a gardener, she kept livestock of all kinds, chickens, pigs, cows, whatever. And later she obtained a license, I thought this was interesting, to actually operate a brewery. And a couple of comments I read said that the beer was rather good. Okay? It was what type of German beer, but it was rather good. She kept that for a number of years. But she managed all aspects of their home. Not that Luther didn't do things, but he was first and foremost a teacher and a preacher. That's what he did. And he traveled around a lot in Germany. So Katharina is the homebody who is in charge of everything. A good German pastor's wife. Their home together was rich and blessed. Besides family home devotions, Martin promised tonight, I thought this was interesting too, that Katharina, when he finished his complete Bible in 1535, Katharina, if you will read the Bible in 1 year, cover to cover, I'll give you 50 gulden, which is a pretty nice price. And some commentators said, well, I don't know where he got the money, but she read the Bible from cover to cover in 1 year, and he handed her the prize. So she did that. They both shared a love for music, and she often joined Martin as he played and sang, as you saw on the painting, with children, friends, and guests. She also supervised several hired hands in how they cared for their home and their property. And she served her husband as nurse and masseuse. So she tended to him from head to toe, basically. Over the years, Martin had many pet names for Katharina. He called her the Morning Star of Wittenberg. Why? Because she was always up at 4 a.m. How many out here get up at 4 a.m.? I sometimes wake up at 4 a.m., but that doesn't mean I have to be up. Well, she had to be up at 4 a.m. This one I don't quite understand. The Lady of Zulsdorf. The Lady of the Pig Market. That was not a particularly impressive one. Lady Luther, my Lord Katharina, my Empress, and especially my rib. After Adam and Eve, rib. Okay? There's a book, we have it in the library upstairs, called Kitty, My Rib. And why? Because he felt that she was taken out of him and they shared that common bondage in the flesh. He described her devotion to their marriage as my Katharina is in all things so obliging and pleasing to me that I would not exchange my poverty for the riches of, and I had to look this one up, of Croesus, the fabled king of Lydia. If you know the legend of King Midas, okay, Midas, that legend comes from the same part of Asia Minor to the east. the west end of Turkey, over towards towards Greece. And Croesus was a fabled king of that time who had immense wealth. And so he would not exchange his poverty for the riches of that great fabled king. He reckoned her of greater worth than either Venice or the whole country of France. Interesting. I looked and looked and looked, and I could not find a single citation of them ever being recorded as having a fight or tiff. I'm sure she must have gotten upset with them, like the bed. Martin, you haven't made your bed in how long now? A year? This is terrible. But she took care of the situation, and they went on with life. She was that type of a woman. Two great ironies regarding Katharina and Martin. She was not with Luther when he died in Erfurt on 18 February 1546. He was buried, however, back at Wittenberg in the castle church immediately in front, some would say under, the pulpit there. There's a marker on the floor of the church that I so much wanted to see. Finally to see, never did. But it's there, you see pictures of it. So that's when and where he died. She, however, died later. She died in Torgau. But she was not moved back to Wittenberg. Even today, she's buried in Torgau. And there's a monument that has been erected to her. So Luther died at the age of 62, and she died at the age of 53. But they each remained faithful until their deaths. Luther had said on his deathbed, Brother Luther, Brother Martin, do you believe? And he said, I am baptized. Well, Katie was a little more colloquial about it. She said, I will stick to Christ as either a burr to cloth or a burr to a top coat. You know what a burr is?
Yeah.
You go out in the country and you get stuff stuck to you. Some of those things, you've got to get a claw hammer to get it out of the fabric. So she said, I'm sticking with Christ because he's sticking with me. Wonderful testimony at the end of her days. Her legacy. She was a devoted wife to Martin throughout their marriage, and she was really, if you know, I said Psalm 31, it's really Proverbs 31. Boy, tough to get good help, editing your slides, better work on that. Proverbs 31, woman and boy. Luther had her commit the psalm to memory early in their marriage, so it would console her in the sorrows of her life after Luther. She could remember back to that. Across her married life, Luther held many discussions at the dinner table, and these were often recorded by attendees, students and other professors, and as what were called a Tischreden. I gave you the answer to it up here. Tischreden are the table talks. There's a book in our library about this big in the Luther series, the Table Talks. I found by researching that although she's not mentioned in the Table Talks, some commentators say she probably was party to most all of them, all of the discussions, and she may actually have been the leader for a number of them because they had the hallmarks of other things that are recorded that she said or were written about her.
Yeah.
So although it talks about Luther's discussions across the table, Katie had help in the kitchen. She had someone to wash the pots and pans, and she would sit down with a stein of that good beer that she made, and they would have good discussions around the table after dinner. Although her later editors removed her name from these talks, Katharina made many contributions to the discussions of the theology and society. Together, Martin and Katharina lived out not only the model of a Christian marriage, but also that of the Christian parsonage. He and Katharina both championed the value of the Christian home and Christian schooling. Katharina was, as Luther said, a fruitful vine of a wife and bore children like live plants about his table. Directly Lutheran. She has been called the mother of the Reformation, and probably rightfully so. Her legacy is seen in that she is known by her maiden name in the list of saints, Katharina von Bora, her Christian name. The rest of the story. Martin Luther declared, quote, the life of married people, if they are in the faith, deserves to be rated higher than those who are famous for even performing miracles. So he was referring to other saints. So he regarded her as a saint in her own right. It has been rightly stated that perhaps the clearest and surely the most momentous of historic love affairs was that of Friar Martin and Sister Katharina. The act symbolizing and the crowning the whole revolt from Rome created an immense sensation throughout Europe. They were well known. Some consider them notorious, but they were well known. And they were well known for all the right things. Luther declared his feelings about his own marriage to Katharina in summary. The life of married people, if they're in the faith, deserves to be rated higher than those who perform miracles. I already did this. And I can testify personally about the exceedingly happy marriage that has not only bestowed upon me, but was by the grace of God. Questions? Paula.
What makes her a saint?
She was a great Christian woman.
Okay, I have
She's
seen
not a
many
martyr.
great Christian women and stuff like that, but she's just a good German woman who helped her husband. I've seen many military wives who've done what she did.
And there are many that will be saints at some time in the listening to the church too. This is not my personal opinion. I don't disagree with it.
I think she's a great role model. The perfect for the Proverb 31 woman. Yeah, go for it.
What else do you need to say? She lived out that legacy, and the church recognizes her with that legacy. As I said at the opening, she is not an ecumenical saint in that she's not recognized by all the churches.
Okay.
She was not a martyr, okay? She was not a great contender for the faith, like Lucy was, the one we did 2 weeks ago. But nevertheless, as a fine Christian model for us.
I think
As
she's
you
great.
said,
I
a
think she's
Proverbs
feisty.
31 woman.
But, you know, any woman who sits there and goes, you know, and then gets married, I mean, they were burned at that time. There was a lot of
So
burning going on.
if we're recognizing those who went before, why? So that they're examples for us today.
Okay.
If our young women would study her today and her relationship to Martin, which I gave you all the warts and everything of Martin.
Yeah.
I mean, it took a brickbat to hit over the head to convince him, Martin, you ought to get married. But once Martin made up his mind, it was like a bolt of lightning. One day, he announced he was engaged to her. In the afternoon, they were married, and they lived together for 21 years as husband and wife. That's my answer to you.
Okay.
All right? Pat?
Two questions. One, I know that before he got married, his life was often in danger. Was her life ever in danger from Catholics?
As she was escaping, yes. And perhaps later, but once she was in that fold in Wittenberg and was married to Luther, remember Luther had an elector who protected him. Remember when he was going from one of the diet of worms?
Yeah.
Remember he was kidnapped
Yeah.
and taken to the Wartburg?
Well, that's what I was thinking.
His elector kidnapped him and making it look like the enemies took him and did whatever they wanted. But he sequestered him in a castle and said, Luther, you have work to do. I'll protect you. So Luther always had that protection around him, even though the forces of the church and the politics of the society were against him. But once she was married to Luther, she came under that same protection I have to believe. And she was not physically threatened. Now, she did have to leave Wittenberg several times after Luther died. The last time was in 1552, when she left because of Black Plague had come to Wittenberg, and she was in Torgau. And the background, I didn't put it in my briefing, but the background is that one day in an inn or near Torgau, she was with her wagon, and she was moving some things or whatever, and the wagon hit a big bump, and she was thrown from the wagon and thrown into a watery ditch, a cold, watery ditch. She got pneumonia. She probably ingested some of the water, and 3 months later, she died of pneumonia. And witnesses say she was in and out of consciousness and suffered delirium because of pneumonia. They didn't know how to treat pneumonia. But that's how she died. She was escaping, or had escaped, the Black Plague, Black Death, at that time. Does she? The last descendant, I'm not going to get this right. The last prime minister of Germany before Adolf Hitler, can't think of his name, right out of my brain. He was, pardon? Hindenburg is a direct descendant of Luther and Katie. That's the last one. And there are several others that are still out there. I have known people of that name, even here in America, Luther. But yeah, so their lineage still lives, I believe. Okay? Any other things? All right. Thank you for listening. Our next saint, in a different sense again, is a great scholar and a great supporter, without whom we would not have a church here in Fairborn, Ohio called Bethlehem of Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod. Neither of those would have been possible, neither would have the seminary at Fort Wayne or St. Louis been possible without J.K. Wilhelm Leah. Okay? So that's our next thing in 2 weeks. Pastor Casey, I think, will still do his thing on 1 Corinthians or so next week. All right, any other questions? All right, let's then stand and we'll close with the prayer. Thank you. Members of your kingdom, teach us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory,